Good morning, everyone. Welcome to BodhiBrew, offering advantage through insight. I'm your host, Confidy Kong, Creative Director of Bodhi Research Group. In today's episode, we cover diversity, equity, and inclusion. Senior Partner and Managing Director of Boston Consulting Group, Nan DasGupta, and myself will discuss the intricacies of DEI and creating the proper foundations and structure to support the important and relevant integration. Nan DasGupta leads BCG's People and Organization practice in Canada and is the North American leader for women at BCG. She helps move Canada forward by providing insights and expertise on the country's most important issues. So sit back, relax, and enjoy a cup of brew with us. Thanks so much for joining us, Nan. We really appreciate you taking the time. So we're kind of going to go right into it. As the managing director and the senior partner for the past decade and being a part of our people organization chair, I think the best way to start is, can you define what DEI is?
Sure. Technically, and the acronym stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does that mean for a company such as ours and for other corporates is how do you really ensure that you are attracting, retaining, developing, nurturing, and leveraging diversity in your talent base? So it's not everybody is the same. We all think the same. We all do the same things, and therefore we don't actually get to the right solutions or we don't get to the most innovative ideas. So that's the diversity part. It's simply about, are you attracting and retaining diversity? Equity, is about everything that you do in your policies. How equitable is that for diverse talent, right? So for example, as you go out and you're looking to fill certain roles, are you thinking about that recruitment in an equitable way, or are you sort of tilting the scales just by the questions that you're asking, just by where you're looking for talent for one population versus another? So that's equity. How equitable are you in your processes? And then inclusivity or inclusion is probably the most important thing, which is
Absolutely.
What does it feel like to be part of your organization? Do you feel included? Do you feel you can bring your whole self to work? Do you feel you can always put your whole self forward to your colleagues? Do you feel that that's valued? Do you feel even if you may be a little bit different from the person here or the person there or everyone on top, which is usually the case, do you feel you're still included, welcome, you belong, you contribute? So that's what DE&I means. It's a lot, but at the same time, it's a super important thing for all companies to think about.
Absolutely, especially with the last point. I think we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that later on. But I think the best situation, or at least approach that we can have, is how are these practices used in both the professional and the personal life to really ensure that there is a sense of thoroughness with DEI? So I think it's best if you could provide maybe some examples from both the personal and professional life in terms of how you had approached it at BCG.
Yeah. It's a great question because I think the topic has come up more in a professional context. Governments, companies thinking about, are we advancing ourselves from a DE&I perspective? So I think it's most commonly thought of in the professional context. And in the professional context, examples, I already started to describe some of them, is how representative is your workforce? And often what we find is companies, governments, all sorts of organizations do I'm not going to say good job or a decent job, but better job at getting people into the company. But the real focus now is how do we make sure that there's a diversity of talents progressing in the company, in key decision-making roles at the board, leadership positions. So that's an example of what a company needs to focus on. On the equity side, you really do need to be thorough about looking at all of your people processes. So not just recruitment, but retention. Often you will find that companies recognize when they do the analysis that there's a retention challenge. They're bringing people in, they're bringing women in, they're bringing people of color in, but they're not retaining them to the same extent. People are walking out the door. You need to examine why that's happening. And then the other piece, of course, is advancement, as I said. So really examining your promotion policies, right? What are the criteria for selection as you look to advance people? Are they equitable? Are we being honest about what makes good happen at those levels? Or are we actually just doing some pattern recognition and assuming what makes great leadership skills? So those are some examples, just at a corporate level.
Mm-hmm.
On the inclusivity side, that's where I think it gets really interesting at the individual level, right?
Right. So
uh,
if I'm like, let's start with there individually and let's expand
Mhm.
kind of from there as well too.
So when we get to inclusivity, the thing about inclusivity, it's people. It's people engaging with people, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go the opposite way. Like in a company, if I'm going to feel included, it's because my colleagues made me feel included. My
Right.
leader made me feel included. It's because how individuals relate to each other, how individuals team with each other, how individuals inquire about each
Right.
other, right? So then you reflect that back on what does that mean as a person? What does that mean for me as a person? It means I have to be thoughtful about how I engage with people. I have to ask myself, am I interested in people who don't look like me, who have very different backgrounds, who
Right.
had a different path to this career? Am I interested in those people? Am I dismissive when they say something that, oh, wait a minute, I wouldn't have thought about it that way?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I curious? Do I ask the question, I thought of it differently. Where does that come from for you? Like individually, I think we can all try to be a bit more self-aware about how we can be more inclusive,
Right.
more curious, and just, better colleagues and better people, if I'm to be honest,
Absolutely, especially from like a management perspective where you are leading and managing multiple people from different backgrounds with different almost emotional, I guess you could say like emotional states as well too. You need to take a lot into consideration in terms of communication. What are these spaces that you're creating? How do they look? And how are they interacting within the space too? I think also as a leader, you almost have to be very cognizant about that more so than the individual.
I think that's absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
And we know from all the research that leaders play an outsized role.
Massive.
It
Yeah.
matters a lot, right?
It does, yeah.
And it matters a lot, not just what the CEO says, right?
Mm-hmm.
It matters how my direct line manager, my direct supervisor
Mm-hmm.
treats me, engages with me, makes me feel, right? So leaders matter a lot.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, colleagues also matter a lot.
They do.
They have an impact on how we belong in the organization.
Creating that culture as well too.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. And at the individual level, I think we can all think about, where we are in life, how we are with our families, me as a mom, how I'm role modeling to my children, me as a friend or a partner to other people, how do I think about the company that I keep and, my role in cultivating great friendships. Like it actually applies in almost everything that we do.
No, absolutely. And as you mentioned, from the sense of it being individual and then kind of going expanding to your team, whether you're a manager or director or the bigger scope of as like the CEO, I think, for example, at Bodhi Research Group, we started off with a relatively small team. We are a startup company hitting 6 years now. But as we were building our team, we were very mindful about who are the individuals that we wanted to be a part of the team and what could each of them bring. And so when it came to the demographics, we were relatively open about seeing who are the applicants and who are these individuals. And because of that, in setting up these, I guess you could say these objectives and these like considerations, we were able to get such a great breadth of talent. And more notably, we've had interns anywhere from undergraduate to postgraduate. We even had a high school student actually be a part of our team. And it was great because thereafter, when she went into university, she returned every summer and was able to intern with us. And then she was able to also provide a great selection of talent as well too, that whether it was her peers, because she felt that it was such a positive environment for her to work in. And she was a bit mindful about her age at first, but we said, no, we're open to all aspects. I think everyone has something to offer in that space. And we were very inclusive about it. And then on the other end, we've also had an employee come out of retirement and she joined us and she's been great. She's still part of our team to this very day, but you're right. It really needs to be considered on all aspects. And what you kind of get at the end, it's just, you really want to take that approach from starting and building the team really small and also when we're expanding and growing even bigger. So because you've been part of BCG for quite some time, especially with this initiative, I would say that DEI has been relatively more trendy and topical in the last 5 years. However, this has existed for quite some time. So when it comes to building the framework, creating that space, what are some of the, I guess, approaches that you've taken that ensure that it stays evergreen? You know, you've been at this for quite some time, well before it was topical and trendy in the last years. And so I'm very curious how, when something before didn't have a model per se, you were creating that model.
Yeah, I mean, if I reflect back, I mean, it's true that in the last few years, 5 to 10 years probably, there's been this heightened awareness, this heightened focus on DE&I.
Mhm.
Before that, it wasn't really a thing, to be honest,
No,
right? I mean, broadly speaking, there
very
might,
broad strokes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So at BCG, we started our focus on diversity over 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So probably almost 25 years ago. And to be honest, I mean, to be clear, so we're a global consulting firm. Our business is our people.
Mhm.
It's the quality of the advice. It's the level of impact that we have with clients. It's all about our people, right? So people is our value proposition. It's our product. It's everything. And so 25 years ago, our CEO really just made a business decision at the time to say, you know what, our whole advantage is people,
Mhm.
and we need to be much better than we are today at attracting, retaining, developing, and our women.
Mhm.
Right. So consulting, I mean, it's a bit of a trope, I guess, but viewed to be, generally speaking, not the most female friendly industry,
Right.
as an industry. There's a lot of travel, it's a lot of hours, it's, a client service business, clients are everything. So I think traditionally the view has been it hasn't been that friendly for women.
Mhm.
And I think in the numbers today in our industry, not in our company, but our industry, it's still, fairly male dominated. There's been
Right.
change. It's very slow. We recognized, about 25 years ago, our CEO recognized that this is a business imperative for us. Like if it is our ambition to have the best talent, we can't be leaving 50% of the talent pool out of that. So it was a business initiative for us. That's how it started. But over the years, we really started to understand how important it was to be a fabric of our company,
Mhm.
essentially. And so we've grown and we've evolved. We started out, in fact, even before with women, we started out with um, a strategy around our pride community and then women's community. And then we started to think about all other aspects of diversity. And it's a global firm, so that differs a little bit country to
Absolutely.
country. But we've been pretty, as you might expect from a pretty data-oriented, nerdy strategy firm, we were pretty clinical about it. We analyzed the data, we examined what are the barriers for women, at what points in the career stage do those barriers occur, and then how do we address those barriers? That's the approach that we took. And, the work never ends. It's sort of, you got to continually work systematically at the barriers. But some of the things that we found is at a certain career stage, around when the manager stage, the principal stage, we noticed, this is 20 years ago, that that's where we were disproportionately finding women were leaving,
Right.
disproportionate to men. So we did the analysis to figure out why that was, and like I think the standard mythology at the time, or the hypothesis, the prevailing myth at the time, was women leave at that point in the career because they're thinking about family, and
Right.
all of a sudden the travel is inconsistent, so they just opt out. And it turns out when we did the analysis, that was part of it, but candidly, that was also why men were leaving at that career stage. So it wasn't the
It wasn't the
difference.
leading factor.
It
Yeah.
wasn't the factor that explained the difference. The factor that explained the difference was, and there were a few of them, but the most important one was about relationships. So
Yeah, absolutely.
in an up or out business where apprenticeship is the model, it's really important that you have some key sponsorship relationships. And just by the law of numbers and relationship bias, those were not forming as naturally for women as they were for men. So we set out to address that barrier, and we've I think managed really well. At this point now, attrition is at parity between men and women at all career stages at our firm, and it has been for 10 years.
Okay. And like you mentioned prior, was that it does help to do the analysis because looking at the data, you're able to recognize those gaps, you're able to make those steps. However, I still find, at least nowadays, the concept with DI, it is a little bit more difficult to quantify. It's one thing to, again, look at the stats, to look at the data, but another thing to apply in a more natural sense, opposed to just hitting your marks and hitting your objectives. And so, in terms of approaching DI, could you discuss some of the examples in where it's actually applied correctly versus incorrectly? And when I say incorrectly, I don't necessarily mean wrong, but more so, how do we more naturally and holistically implement it as opposed to thinking of just hitting the marks, reaching the data, and getting the numbers in?
When I think about that question, I think about what many companies were doing about 5 years ago,
Right.
and I'm sure some still do, is the focus is purely on the numbers. And if you focus purely on the numbers and on representation, your first lever is just hire more, hire more women, hire more people of color, like just bring them in the door.
Right.
And I would say that has been a major focal point for many companies. It's not the wrong focal point. To your point, it's not incorrect, right? But it doesn't address the really important thing about, okay, you're bringing people in, but are you enabling them to thrive?
Right. Absolutely.
Or are they likely to feel excluded, look up, not see role models, and therefore feel, okay, odds are against me. I'm probably not going to get to that point. So why don't I think about other things? Like, are you really addressing some of the harder issues, right? So I think one thing, companies have been very focused on the numbers, all about representation. Their tendency has been to think about the entry levels, and some of them understood, okay, entry is not enough. If they're not progressing naturally, we've got to bring people in at the senior levels. Then it's an integration question, are
Right.
people really able to thrive? Are we figuring out what conditions are there or not there for them to thrive at those levels? So I guess it comes down to what I think is really important to do is think about the whole ecosystem that's there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not just in the people processes, but in the culture and the environment that you're creating.
As well, like you mentioned, and opposed to the focus of just new applicants or people we're adding into it, I think there's also value to holistically approaching it from internally as well. What do we have currently that we could improve? What are certain infrastructure that we could create or at least refocus on that we can make a stronger foundation before we start bringing in the new applicants, before we're, fixated on hitting a specific number? Because like you said, it's one thing to be able to hit a quota, but another thing to retain them and have them stay and actually foster a culture where it does feel natural, where it does feel inviting, and it does allow for like a naturally inclusive space. I think that's more of the bigger challenge is that, and people feel it, people do feel it when it's something that is natural in the business or in the culture itself versus contrived. I'm using
Yeah.
that lightly, contrived, but
I think that's right. And it brings up, in my mind anyway, another thought around sort of newer things that companies are sort of discovering.
Mhm.
I mean, the truth is, in a country like ours, in Canada or in North America, most people are intersectional,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So if we're too blunt about it, if we're too crude in our thinking about, okay, all women want this, or all people of color want this,
Right.
we might still be alienating people, you know?
Absolutely.
So increasingly, at least in our firm, we're recognizing that we really do need to think at the individual level,
Mhm.
right? And not make assumptions about everybody wants this or everybody wants that, but just genuinely embrace respect for the individual, embracing difference, valuing difference, curiosity as a value, valuing diverse perspectives, learning how to team, embracing the fact that, hey, we've all got a different thought here, like
Mhm.
how do we actually get the best outcome from that richness of diverse thinking?
Right. No, I think that is a great holistic approach, but also an approach that's quite quantifiable, at least for individuals and other firms to look at. I think with BCG, this is something that is quite impressive given that it is a global firm, well over 30,000 employees with offices in different countries and different places where different subsets of people exist, and it's mindful to be taking a more curated approach with each of the offices or each of the locations, you could say as well too. So thank you so much for sharing that aspect of it. I really do believe that taking that type of holistic approach is crucial, both with something that is still quantifiable, some data we can look at. But the last question for you, given that I did say it is quite topical, is DEI a trend or is it here to stay?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, the optimist in me
Right.
believes that, as a human species, we actually are just hopefully, eventually, we don't need DEI anymore.
Right.
We evolve in our mindset and our ability to just connect with each other socially and innately.
Right.
It just becomes how we roll. We value difference. We see everybody for who they are, and we appreciate the strength of working across lines. That's the optimist in me. I think that's the destination. That's the
Right.
nirvana, right? So from that perspective, it may seem like a blip, a trend right now, heightened focus. I believe some companies are figuring it out. Like they need to just integrate an equity and inclusivity lens in everything that they do. So for them, it's no longer just something they're standing tall momentarily. It's become who they are. For other companies, I do think it needs to persist. It needs to persist as a prevailing trend. Let me put it that way.
Prevailing trend. I like that one.
Prevailing
Yes.
trend, because there's so much more work to be done. To be honest, there's so much more work to be done. So we can't lose sight of it.
No, absolutely. Thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak about this topic.
You're very welcome.